The rain started just as they folded the flag. It wasn't a storm, just a cold, steady drizzle that soaked through black dresses and dark suits while the minister's voice trembled over the open grave. I stood there staring at the polished wood of Thomas's casket, my fingers numb, my ears ringing. After 30 years of marriage, all I had left was a triangle of fabric pressed into my hands and the echo of the gun salute fading into gray clouds. Thomas Holloway wasn't just my husband. He was the teacher who stayed late to help failing students pass. The man who shoveled our elderly neighbor's driveway before sunrise. The steady heartbeat of our home. And then, in the middle of the final prayer, someone cleared their throat behind me. I turned. Gerald Pike, perfectly pressed coat. Dry umbrella, clipboard tucked under his arm like this was just another Tuesday inspection. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said flatly, already extending an envelope. "Unfortunately, you're in violation of community guidelines. Unapproved memorial display. Excessive street parking." For a moment, I didn't understand the words. They floated somewhere above the sound of dirt hitting the casket. "You're fining me?" My voice barely worked. "The rules apply to everyone," Gerald replied, as if he were discussing lawn height. Around us, neighbors stiffened. Whispers spread. Someone gasped. I felt every eye on me, not with comfort, but with stunned disbelief. I looked down at the paper. A fine amount printed neatly at the bottom, dated today. Today, while my husband was being buried. The grief that had hollowed me out suddenly filled with something sharp and burning. This wasn't bureaucracy. This wasn't policy. This was cruelty, deliberate and precise. Gerald nodded once, already stepping back into the crowd as if he had completed a routine task. I stared at the number again, rain blurring the ink. He thought I was too broken to fight. He was wrong. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before the funeral, before the fine. Before Gerald Pike decided rules mattered more than humanity, there was Willow Creek Estates. When Thomas and I first drove through the stone entrance 15 years ago, it looked like a postcard. Identical mailboxes painted a soft cream, lawns trimmed like they'd been measured with rulers. Flower beds bursting with obedient rows of tulips. It felt safe. Predictable, peaceful. After years of cramped apartments and long commutes, we wanted quiet. Thomas used to joke that he had spent enough time breaking up high school hallway fights. He didn't want to referee adulthood, too. He fell in love with the neighborhood instantly. Within weeks of moving in, he was hosting Saturday barbecues. Half his students showed up at some point over the years, kids who needed tutoring, advice about college, or just a steady adult to remind them they mattered. Our driveway became a gathering place. Neighbors brought over pies, laughter carried down the street on warm evenings. Back then, the HOA felt like background noise, a monthly newsletter. Seasonal decorating contests, reminders about trash bins. We paid our dues, waved at the board members during the annual meeting, and thought little of it. That was before Gerald Pike. He hadn't always been president. When we moved in, the HOA board was a sleepy committee of retirees who mostly argued about shrubbery. Gerald appeared a few years later, precise, ambitious, sharp-eyed. He ran for treasurer first, then vice president. And after a messy election that split the community right down the middle, he claimed the presidency by a margin of 3 votes. I remember the tension that summer, accusations about proxy ballots, murmurs about technicalities, but most of us shrugged it off. It was just an HOA, after all. How much damage could someone really do with a clipboard? At first, nothing dramatic happened, just adjustments. The newsletters got longer, the language sharper. Words like compliance, uniformity, and property value preservation started appearing in bold. Then came the first wave of violation letters. A garden gnome deemed non-conforming, a basketball hoop disrupting aesthetic balance, a warning to a young couple because their garage door had been left open too long. Thomas would shake his head, amused but mildly annoyed. "He's running this place like a military academy," he'd say, over grass. The first letter we received was almost laughable. Our wind chimes. Apparently, they were audibly disruptive beyond acceptable decibel levels. I stood on the porch reading the notice while Thomas leaned against the doorframe behind me, listening to the soft, harmless tinkling in the breeze. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. We removed them anyway. It wasn't worth a fight, but something shifted after that. Not just in the rules, in the way neighbors interacted. People started measuring each other, comparing, reporting. Gerald had a way of smiling without warmth. He'd stroll past houses slowly, hands clasped behind his back, inspecting. He spoke often about protecting the image of Willow Creek, about maintaining standards. He talked about property values like they were sacred scripture. Yet certain homes were untouched. His close friends' lawns grew slightly taller. Their holiday decorations stayed up longer. The enforcement wasn't equal, it was selective. Thomas noticed. At one HOA meeting, he politely questioned why the board's legal expenses had doubled in a year when there were no lawsuits disclosed. Gerald deflected smoothly, citing confidential matters. The room grew quiet. Afterward, a few neighbors privately thanked Thomas for asking. Gerald smiled toward us, never quite looked the same again. Still, life continued. Thomas kept teaching. We kept hosting small gatherings. We believed decency would outweigh pettiness. Then Thomas got sick. It started with fatigue, then hospital visits. Then words like aggressive and treatment options. Our world shrank to doctor appointments and medication schedules. The laughter in our driveway faded. The barbecue grill stayed cold. During hospice, a medical bed was placed in our living room near the window so Thomas could see the maple tree he loved. Tubing, monitors, oxygen equipment. 3 days after it was installed, I opened our mailbox to find an envelope stamped HOA compliance notice. Visible medical equipment from sidewalk, it read, must be screened or relocated to maintain community appearance. I remember standing there, paper trembling in my hands, looking through the window at my husband, thin, pale, fighting for breath, and something inside me finally cracked. This wasn't about wind chimes. This wasn't about lawn height. Something was deeply wrong with the people running this neighborhood. I didn't even make it through the night before calling the HOA office. Thomas's side of the bed was still untouched. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand. The folded flag rested in a wooden case on the dresser, and on the kitchen table beneath the soft glow of the overhead light lay the violation notice Gerald had handed me at the graveside. I dialed the number at 8 sharp the next morning. Gerald answered himself. Willow Creek Estates, President Pike speaking. This is Mary Ann Holloway. My voice was steadier than I felt. You find me during my husband's funeral. A pause. Papers shuffling. Yes, Mrs. Holloway. The memorial display exceeded approved dimensions, and the number of vehicles parked along the curb violated Section 4 of. My husband was being buried, I cut in. The regulations apply uniformly, he replied. No hesitation. No softness. If we make exceptions, we set precedents. Precedents. I stared at the wreath still propped by the front door, at the stack of folded metal chairs neighbors had used to sit with me after the service. You're penalizing me for flowers, I said quietly. An unauthorized gathering infrastructure, he corrected. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking. The next envelope arrived 2 days later. A breakdown of the fines. One charge for oversized memorial wreath. Another for temporary seating placed without prior approval. An additional line item for excessive street congestion. They even counted the cars belonging to Thomas's former students who had driven hours to say goodbye. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. The clubhouse smelled like lemon cleaner and stale coffee. I hadn't stepped inside in years. About 20 residents sat in neat rows of folding chairs. Gerald stood at the front with a projector screen behind him, looking every bit the composed authority figure. When he saw me enter, his eyebrows lifted slightly. We'll move to open discussion, he announced after finishing a presentation about landscaping compliance. Mrs. Brand points. Holloway, I assume you're here regarding your outstanding violations. Every head turned. I walked to the front, feeling the weight of their eyes. Lena Morales caught my gaze from the second row. She gave me a small, encouraging nod. Lena had lived across from us for a decade, a nurse with a sharp mind and a sharper sense of fairness. Yes, I said. I'm here because I was fined while my husband was being buried. A murmur rippled through the room. Gerald folded his hands. We empathize with your loss. However, Willow Creek Estates maintains clear policies regarding property presentation and public access. You're talking about flowers and chairs, I said. People came to support me. You did not file a temporary event request form, he replied. Had you done so, this might have been avoided. The room went very still. Pastor Eli Grant, who had officiated the funeral, slowly stood from the back. Mr. Sumber. Pike, he said calmly, I've conducted funerals in this town for 30 years. I have never once seen paperwork required for grief. A few neighbors nodded. Gerald's jaw tightened. This is not a church matter, Pastor. This is a homeowners association. He clicked his remote, and my address appeared on the projector screen. Photos of my front yard, taken from the sidewalk, filled the wall behind him. The wreath, the chairs. Even a hospice bed visible faintly through the window in one image. Humiliation burned through me. Mrs. Holloway has accumulated penalties totaling. He read the number aloud. Gasps echoed. Lena stood up. This is absurd. We've had birthday parties with bounce houses that block half the street. No fines then. Those events were pre-approved, Gerald said sharply. And my husband's death needed scheduling, I asked. Gerald ignored me and addressed the room instead. Failure to resolve these violations within 7 days will result in additional daily fines. Continued non-compliance may initiate lien procedures against the property. The word hit like a physical blow, lien. I felt suddenly unsteady. Thomas and I had paid off that house 5 years ago. It was the one thing we were proud of, fully ours. After the meeting, Lena squeezed my hand. He's targeting you, she whispered, ever since Thomas questioned the board's finances. That night, another letter arrived, certified mail this time. Notice of intent to lien. The language was colder than the last. Legal references. Deadlines. Threats of further action. I drove to Gerald's house the next morning, desperation overriding pride. He answered the door in a pressed shirt, expression unreadable. Please, I said, you've made your point. Waive the fines, let this go. He didn't blink. You have 7 days to remit payment in full, he said evenly, or the association will proceed with legal action. And just like that, the war was no longer quiet. The bright orange notice appeared on my front door 3 days later. It wasn't mailed. It wasn't slipped quietly into the mailbox. It was taped across the wood like a public warning label, bold letters screaming violation, final notice for anyone walking past to see. I stood on the porch staring at it while 2 neighbors slowed their morning jog to read it from across the street. I didn't blame them for looking. That was the point. Gerald wanted spectacle. By afternoon, the tone of the neighborhood had shifted. The usual friendly waves disappeared. Conversations that used to happen in mailboxes now stopped the moment I approached. Lena still came by, but she whispered one evening that she'd received a reminder email from the HOA about associating with properties under review. Associating. As if grief were contagious. 2 men wearing neon vests showed up the following Monday claiming to be part of a landscape compliance inspection team. They didn't knock. They walked straight into my backyard through the side gate, measuring tape in hand. I stepped outside barefoot, heart hammering. You can't just come back here. Section 9 allows inspection access, one of them muttered, not even making eye contact. They photographed the grass near the fence line. It had grown slightly uneven. I hadn't had the strength to mow in over a week. Later that afternoon, another violation notice arrived. Lawn exceeding approved height standards. A fine attached. I stared at the wording in disbelief. My husband had been buried less than 2 weeks earlier. That evening, I received an email from Gerald himself. Personal circumstances do not exempt homeowners from maintaining community standards. Personal circumstances. I barely slept anymore. Every sound outside made me tense. I found myself checking the driveway cameras Thomas had installed years ago just in case. I'd sit at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, surrounded by envelopes, fines stacking like a second mortgage. Then the mailbox was ripped open. I discovered it one morning hanging crooked, metal bent inward. Mail scattered on the grass. For a split second, I wondered if I was being robbed. But nothing was taken. Instead, another notice appeared that afternoon stating the mailbox damage violated community appearance standards and would require replacement within 48 hours or incur additional penalties. I drove to the HOA office in a fury. You're blaming me for vandalism, I demanded. Gerald adjusted his tie calmly. The association cannot be responsible for community non-compliance behaviors. Community non-compliance? My voice cracked. Someone destroyed my property. Then you should contact local authorities, he said smoothly. But until repairs are made, the violation stands. It felt deliberate. Like pressure tightening from every direction. Neighbors later told me they'd received subtle warnings, suggestions that property values could suffer if certain homes weren't brought into compliance. The isolation was worse than the fines. Bills began arriving from hospice care. Utility statements, insurance paperwork. I sat at the dining table one night with a calculator trying to make sense of it all, realizing the HOA penalties alone had already climbed into thousands with daily additions. Grief had barely begun to settle when fear replaced it. The doorbell rang one afternoon, and for a moment I felt relief. Maybe someone had finally come to check on me. Instead, it was another courier. Certified mail. My hands trembled as I signed. Inside was a formal notice stamped with legal language thicker and colder than anything before. Due to continued non-payment of assessed fines and penalties, Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association hereby initiates foreclosure review procedures in accordance with community bylaws. The room seemed to tilt. Foreclosure on the house Thomas and I built our lives in. On the home we paid off together. I sank into a chair, the paper slipping from my hands. They weren't just harassing me anymore. They were trying to take everything. I didn't cry when I read the word foreclosure. I think I had run out of tears. Instead, something else settled into me, something steadier, colder. Lena came over that evening with a casserole I didn't touch and a look on her face I hadn't seen before. "This isn't about your lawn," she said quietly, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "And it's not about the funeral." I slid the foreclosure notice toward her. "Then what is it about?" She hesitated, then pulled a folded envelope from her purse. "Thomas came to me 6 months ago," she said. "He asked if I'd noticed the HOA dues increasing every year without any visible improvements." I blinked. "He mentioned the legal expenses once. I didn't realize he was still looking into it." "He was," Lena said. "He requested financial disclosures. Gerald gave him summaries, not itemized statements. Thomas didn't like that." A strange memory surfaced. Thomas sitting at this very table late one night, glasses low on his nose, spreadsheets open on his laptop. I'd asked what he was working on. "Just numbers," he'd said lightly. "Something doesn't add up." After Lena left, I went upstairs and opened the closet where I'd stored Thomas's briefcase. It still smelled faintly like his cologne. Inside, beneath old lesson plans and grade sheets, was a thick manila folder. Across the tab, in Thomas's careful handwriting, HOA audit. My hand shook as I carried it downstairs. Inside were copies of HOA financial reports, printed emails, handwritten notes in the margins. He had highlighted inconsistencies, thousands of dollars allocated to legal consulting with no documented cases. Landscaping contracts awarded repeatedly to the same company owned by Gerald's cousin. Emergency funds withdrawn without board votes. And then, I found something that made my pulse spike. A separate account labeled Enforcement Retainer Fund. It wasn't listed in the annual budget shared with homeowners. Thomas had circled it in red. Underneath, he'd written, "Ask where this money is actually going." The room suddenly felt too small. This wasn't just overreach. It was selective enforcement and possibly something worse. As I flipped through the pages, I found copies of emails Thomas had sent to Gerald requesting clarification. The tone was polite, professional, but firm. One email stood out. "Transparency protects everyone," Thomas had written, "especially leadership." Gerald's response had been brief. "We will address your concerns at the appropriate time." There had been no follow-up. Lena was right. This wasn't about wreaths or grass height. Gerald hadn't targeted a grieving widow. He'd targeted the only person in the neighborhood who had started asking the wrong questions. And when Thomas got sick, when he was too weak to attend meetings or request documents, Gerald saw his opening. A foreclosure threat would silence any lingering inquiry, remove the problem entirely. I felt something shift inside my chest, not grief, not fear. Resolve. The next morning, I made copies of everything in that folder. Every highlighted discrepancy, every unexplained expense. I organized them into a binder. Then I called the town clerk's office. "I need to speak to someone about HOA financial compliance," I said. There was a pause on the line. "Are you filing a formal complaint?" "Yes," I answered without hesitation. By afternoon, I had an appointment scheduled with a member of the town council who oversaw community associations. I also emailed several neighbors Thomas had trusted over the years, people who had quietly questioned dues increases but never pushed further. The responses came faster than I expected. I always wondered where the money went. "They fined us for a fence but let Gerald's friend build a shed without permits. Tell me how I can help." The isolation I'd felt for weeks began to crack. I wasn't alone. That night, I drove past the clubhouse and saw Gerald's car parked outside. The lights were on. He was likely preparing paperwork for my foreclosure review, confident I'd crumble under pressure. He thought grief had made me weak. He thought the threat of losing my home would scare me into silence. I stood in my living room afterward, looking at Thomas's photograph on the mantel. The same quiet smile he'd worn when he believed fairness would win. "You were right," I whispered. "Transparency does protect everyone." Then I closed the audit binder and placed it neatly on the table. They picked the wrong widow. The town attorney's office didn't look like a place where revolutions started. It was small, fluorescent lights, a faded flag in the corner. But when I laid Thomas's audit binder across that polished desk, it felt like setting down something explosive. Attorney Carla Nguyen adjusted her glasses and began flipping through the pages in silence. Highlighter marks. Email threads. Bank transfers circled in red. "How long has this been going on?" she asked finally. "At least a year," I said. "Maybe longer." She paused at the page labeled Enforcement Retainer Fund. "This account wasn't disclosed in annual homeowner summaries?" "No." Her expression shifted from neutral professionalism to something sharper. "You understand," she said carefully, "if these documents are accurate, this isn't just overzealous enforcement. This could be financial misconduct." The word misconduct sounded almost too polite. "I'm filing a formal complaint," I replied, "not just for me." Carla nodded slowly. "Then we do this properly. Documentation. Witness statements." We moved through the county oversight board. For the first time since the funeral, I felt like I wasn't reacting. I was advancing. While I met with Carla, Lena went to work in her own way. She knocked on doors quietly, choosing neighbors who had once confided frustrations to Thomas. She didn't dramatize. She simply asked one question: "Were you ever fined unfairly?" The answers came in waves. A young couple who had been charged for holiday lighting imbalance, while Gerald's friend displayed a yard full of inflatable decorations without penalty. An elderly man who received daily fines for a cracked driveway while waiting for insurance approval after a storm. A single mother who had been threatened with legal action over a swing set visible from the sidewalk. One by one, they wrote statements, signed them. Some did so nervously, glancing toward the street as if expecting Gerald to appear at any moment. Pastor Eli worked more subtly. From the pulpit on Sunday, he spoke about accountability, about stewardship, about how power without transparency erodes trust. He never mentioned the HOA directly, but everyone understood. After service, small groups gathered in hushed conversations. Word traveled without flyers or social media posts. It spread the old-fashioned way, through community. 3 days after filing my complaint with the County Oversight Board, a notice appeared in everyone's mailbox. Emergency HOA Meeting Agenda, Enforcement Action Review, Property 214 Willow Creek Lane, my address. Gerald wasn't backing down. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning. A vote would be held to authorize final lien proceedings and begin foreclosure filing. It was bold, aggressive, public. Exactly what he wanted. I drove past the clubhouse that evening and saw lights blazing inside again. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Gerald pacing, phone pressed to his ear. He thought he was tightening the noose. He didn't realize I had already pulled the floorboards up beneath him. That night, I sat at the dining table and reorganized the binder. Section 1, Financial Discrepancies. Section 2, Selective Enforcement Cases. Section 3, Undisclosed Accounts. Section 4, Witness Testimonies. I printed copies for the town attorney, for the county board representative, and one for myself. I attached sticky tabs so nothing could be missed. At 2 in the morning, exhaustion tried to creep in. Doubt whispered that this might still fail, that Gerald could twist narratives the way he always had. But then I looked at Thomas's handwriting on those pages. He had started this. I would finish it. Friday afternoon, another envelope arrived, this one addressed to the entire community. The location of the emergency meeting had changed. Not the clubhouse, not the HOA office. The park pavilion. I stared at the address printed at the bottom. Maple Grove Pavilion. The same open-air structure where Thomas had hosted school fundraisers every summer, where he'd organized charity book drives, where students once stood in line for his homemade lemonade. Gerald had chosen it for optics, a bigger space, a stage. He wanted witnesses. He was going to get them. Saturday morning. 10 o'clock. The battleground had been set. Saturday morning arrived too calm. The sky was clear. The kind of gentle blue Thomas used to love. The kind that made the world feel harmless. I parked along the edge of Maple Grove Park and sat behind the wheel for a moment, my hands resting on the audit binder in my lap. I expected maybe 15 people. The board members. A few curious neighbors. Gerald's loyal circle. A quiet public execution. When I stepped onto the gravel path leading to the pavilion, my heart thudded harder than it had at the funeral. Gerald stood at the front near a folding table, microphone set up, portable speaker humming faintly with feedback. He wore a navy blazer despite the warm morning. Composed, prepared. Certain, he caught my eye and offered a tight smile. "Mrs. Holloway," he said smoothly as I approached, "I appreciate your attendance." I didn't answer. I walked to the second row and sat down, placing the binder on my knees. For a few seconds, the pavilion felt nearly empty. Then Lena arrived. She didn't wave. She simply sat beside me, her shoulder brushing mine in silent solidarity. A minute later, Pastor Eli stepped in, hands folded in front of him. Then I heard more footsteps. I turned. The elderly man with the cracked driveway shuffled in, leaning on his cane. The young couple with the holiday light find took seats in the back. The single mother with the swing set sat near the aisle. More came, not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in weeks avoided eye contact with Gerald and instead looked at me, some with apology, some with quiet resolve. Gerald's smile thinned. He tapped the microphone. "Let's begin." The board members lined up behind him, shuffling papers. A printed packet lay on the table labeled Enforcement Action, Holloway Property. Gerald cleared his throat. "Today we convene to address continued non-compliance at 214 Willow Creek Lane. Despite repeated notices and opportunities to resolve outstanding violations, the homeowner has failed to remit payment." He spoke clinically, efficiently, like he was discussing a cracked sidewalk. I tightened my grip on the binder. He detailed the fines, the dates, the cumulative amount, each number echoing through the pavilion. "Therefore," he continued, "the board moves to authorize final lien execution and initiate foreclosure proceedings in accordance with community bylaws." The word foreclosure rippled through the crowd. I scanned the faces around me, some shocked, some uneasy, a few nodding cautiously, as if unsure which way safety leaned. Gerald lifted a sheet of paper. "All in favor of proceeding with enforcement action, please raise your hand." The air seemed to freeze. For a split second, no one moved. Then one of the board members raised her hand. Another followed. Two neighbors near the front slowly lifted theirs, glancing around as if checking for permission. Gerald's posture straightened, confidence returning. "Count the votes," he instructed sharply. I felt my pulse in my throat, my palms damp against the binder's cardboard edge. This was the moment he'd been building toward. Public pressure. Forced compliance. A spectacle meant to make an example out of me. I thought of Thomas standing in this very pavilion years earlier, laughing with students while handing out raffle tickets. The irony almost made me dizzy. More hands began to lift, hesitant, half-raised, uncertain. Gerald's lips curved slightly. He believed fear would win. I exhaled slowly. Enough. Before the board secretary could finish counting, I stood. The scrape of my chair against the concrete cut through the murmurs. "Before you finalize anything," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest, "there's something you need to see." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Morneau." "Holloway, you'll have time to speak after the vote." "No," I replied. "Now." A hush fell. I placed the audit binder on the table in front of him. "You want transparency?" I asked quietly. "Let's have it." For a heartbeat, Gerald didn't move. Then, the pavilion doors behind me swung open. The doors didn't just open. They filled. First, attorney Carla Nguyen stepped through, calm and deliberate, a leather briefcase tucked beneath her arm. Behind her came two members of the town council, faces most of the neighborhood recognized from election season. And then more footsteps followed. Dozens. Former students of Thomas, now adults. Parents he had once helped navigate college applications. The elderly veteran who lived 3 streets over. Members of the local veterans group in pressed jackets. Neighbors who had stayed silent too long. The pavilion, moments ago tense and divided, suddenly felt crowded with witnesses. Gerald's composure cracked, just slightly. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Carla walked forward without raising her voice. "This is a formal oversight inquiry under State Homeowners Association statutes. We received a complaint supported by financial documentation." She placed her briefcase on the table beside my binder and opened it. "You may not proceed with any foreclosure action until this review is complete." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Gerald straightened. This is an internal association matter. It became a legal matter when funds were misrepresented and selectively enforced, Carla replied evenly. I stepped forward and opened the binder. These are the HOA financial records from the past year, I said, my voice clearer now than it had been in weeks. Highlighted sections show undocumented withdrawals from a secondary enforcement fund, landscaping contracts awarded repeatedly to family affiliates, legal retainers paid without disclosure. I flipped to the next tab. These are testimonies from residents fined under inconsistent standards. Lena stood up behind me. I signed one. Then the elderly man with the cane, so did I. One by one, voices rose. Gerald's face flushed red. This is character assassination. No, Carla said calmly. This is documentation. One of the council members stepped forward, scanning the pages. Mr. Pike, why was this enforcement retainer account not included in annual homeowner disclosures? Gerald opened his mouth, then closed it. It was administrative. State law requires full transparency of association-controlled funds, the council member replied. Failure to disclose is a violation. The word violation hung in the air like poetic justice. The crowd began shifting, not uncertain now, but angry. You find her at a funeral? Someone shouted. You threatened foreclosure over flowers? Board members behind Gerald started whispering to one another. One of them, the woman who had raised her hand first, slowly stepped away from the table. I wasn't aware of these accounts, she said quietly. I was only given summary sheets. Another board member removed his name badge and set it down. I resign, he muttered, stepping back into the crowd. The unraveling happened fast. The sheriff entered last, hat tucked under his arm, 2 deputies behind him. We've been asked to collect association financial records pending review, he said firmly. Gerald took a step backward. This is absurd, he snapped. You can't just— We can, the sheriff replied evenly. And we are. A deputy began boxing up folders from the table. Gerald reached for one instinctively, but the sheriff's hand stopped him mid-motion. Sir. The authority in that single word ended it. Around us, neighbors who had once avoided my gaze were now looking directly at Gerald, not with fear, but with disappointment. The same pavilion he had chosen as a stage had become his reckoning. Carla turned to the crowd. Until further notice, enforcement actions are suspended. An interim board will be appointed pending investigation. Applause started slowly, hesitant at first, then grew. It wasn't wild cheering, it was release. I stood there in the center of it, the binder still open in front of me. My hands trembled, but not from fear. Gerald was escorted away from the table, no longer president, just a man under investigation. For weeks he had tried to isolate me. Instead, he had united the town. As the applause echoed beneath the pavilion roof, I reached into my purse and pulled out the small photo of Thomas I'd carried with me, the one from our last summer fundraiser here, him smiling beneath strings of lights. I looked at it, feeling something settle deep in my chest. Not revenge, not anger, justice. And for the first time since the rain fell over his grave, I felt like I could finally breathe. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek Estates felt like a neighborhood waking up from a long, uneasy sleep. The County Oversight Board moved quickly. Gerald Pike was formally removed from his position pending a civil investigation into financial misconduct and misuse of association funds. The enforcement retainer account was frozen. Bank statements were subpoenaed. For the first time since he had taken office, the numbers were no longer hidden behind polished summaries and vague language. The HOA itself was temporarily dissolved under emergency review. An interim board was formed, not appointed in secret, not decided over private dinners, but voted on in an open community meeting held right there at Maple Grove Pavilion. Residents who had never spoken up before stood in line to cast ballots. Transparency became more than a word, it became policy. The first motion passed unanimously. All pending fines against 214 Willow Creek Lane were voided. When the vote was announced, I didn't clap. I just closed my eyes for a moment and let the weight lift. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about dignity, about restoring what should never have been stripped away in the first place. One by one, neighbors came to my door in the days after. Some brought flowers. Some brought pies, most brought apologies. I should have said something sooner. I was afraid. I didn't think it would go that far. I listened to each of them without anger. Fear had kept them quiet. And fear, I now understood, spreads easily when power goes unchecked, but so does courage. The idea for the memorial garden wasn't mine. It was Lena's. We need something that reminds us who we are, she said one evening as we sat on my porch, not who we tried to make us. The vacant lot beside the park pavilion, the one long neglected and overgrown, was approved by the interim board for community restoration. Volunteers showed up with shovels and gloves. Former students of Thomas organized a book donation drive to fund benches. The veterans group planted maple saplings along the perimeter. At the center, they placed a simple bronze plaque, Thomas Holloway Teacher. Neighbor. Integrity matters. The day the garden was dedicated, I stood beneath those young maple trees and watched children run between the flower beds. The same kind of laughter that once echoed through our driveway returned, softer but real. Pastor Eli spoke briefly about resilience, about how grief can either hollow us out or carve us into something stronger. I didn't feel strong during the funeral, or during the foreclosure notice, or during those sleepless nights surrounded by violation letters. But standing there, I realized something. Grief hadn't disappeared, it had transformed. It had become clarity. The interim board later asked if I would serve on the newly formed Oversight and Transparency Committee, a group designed to ensure full financial disclosure and equitable enforcement moving forward. I hesitated at first. I had never wanted politics. I had wanted peace, but peace without accountability isn't peace at all. So I said yes, not because I wanted power, because I never wanted another family to receive an orange notice on the worst day of their lives. Now, when I sit on my front porch in the evenings, the neighborhood feels different. Not perfect, but honest. People talk again, they wave. They linger at mailboxes without glancing over their shoulders. The lawn still grows uneven sometimes. No one measures it with a tape. Tonight, the sun dips low over Willow Creek, casting long golden light across the street. The maple in our yard, Thomas's favorite, rustles gently in the breeze. I stand in the front yard, barefoot in the grass, watching neighbors walk past the memorial garden down the street. I don't feel alone anymore. The town chose decency over bureaucracy. And this house, this home, finally feels like ours again. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?